The Imperium of Man is not a tolerant society. There is a reason why its enemies are always classified as the alien, the mutant, and the heretic. In other words, the non-human sapient, the genetically impure, and the nonconformist. If you are one of those poor souls born with mutation, your best hope is to pray that it is minor enough that nobody notices. Failing that, pray that it is minor enough that at the very least you will be classified as an abhuman. Yes, you will be reduced to second-class status and essentially be a slave, but at least you'll still get to live. That is, if you define a life of unending, back-breaking, degrading menial labor in service to an uncaring empire as living. It's little wonder, therefore, that so many mutants in the Imperium find the allure of chaos so appealing. Sure, there is the constant backstabbing, the brain-melting insanity, the mindless savagery, and of course the risk of turning into a gibbering chaos spawn. But hey, at least if you work for the ruinous gods, chances are there'll be someone or something else that you'll actually be able to vent your frustrations on. The only way to avoid either of these two options is to be born with a mutation that is somehow useful, indeed indispensable, to the Imperium. And these unfortunately only come in two varieties. You can be born a psyker, which is almost entirely down to random chance, which means in turn that you are either sacrificed as fuel for the Golden Throne, or you are forced to undergo rigorous mental conditioning, and even then you are still treated like a walking pack of C4 waiting to explode, or you can be born a Navigator. You are still destined for an existence of life-threatening danger and potentially crippling insanity, but for once, the perks actually more than make up for the dangers. Because if you're a Navigator, you are arguably, as an individual, more necessary to the survival of the Imperium than anyone else. If you and others like you no longer exist, then all the bolt guns of the Astartes, the techno-wizardry of the Mechanicus, all the piety and faith of the Sororitas and Inquisition combined will not save the Imperium from falling to pieces. You will be, as I said earlier, utterly indispensable. And in terms of material benefits, like, say, money and power, you can get a lot of mileage out of being indispensable. 40K is a universe that borrows from a lot of various sci-fi and fantasy properties. The setting of a galaxy-spanning empire in decline was first encountered in Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. The famous power armor of the Space Marines can trace its literary DNA all the way back to Starship Troopers, the book, not the film. The plot device of chaos as the ultimate big bad is derived from the multiverse of British author Michael Moorcock, creator of such characters as Dorian Hawkmoon, Prince Coram, and Elric of Melniboné. The Orcs and the Eldar are so clearly inspired by Lord of the Rings that Games Workshop had to do some necessary name changes in order to avoid being sued by the Tolkien estate, while the aesthetic of the Tau is an obvious nod to Japanese sci-fi and mecha anime of the 80s and 90s. It's not that surprising, therefore, that 40K would borrow not only the title of God Emperor, but also the concept of a class of mutants who play a vital role in interstellar travel from arguably one of the most famous sci-fi series of all time, Frank Herbert's Dune. But where the Navigators in Dune mutate into vaguely fish-like humanoids, or whatever the hell that thing from the David Lynch film was, the Navigators in 40K only have a third eye in the middle of their forehead. Pretty tame by comparison. Also, where the Navigator in Dune uses drug-fueled prescience to safely guide ships through folded space, the Navigator uses his third eye to make sure that a ship doesn't get lost in the madness-inducing hellscape of the warp. Now, the warp isn't the only means of faster-than-light travel in Warhammer 40K, but it is undeniably the fastest way, and speed is essential in a galaxy-spanning empire constantly beset on all sides. Getting an army from Sector A to Sector B in a timely fashion can very well mean the difference between keeping a planet and losing it. There is the Eldar webway, which is just as fast and even safer, but the pointy-eared Xenos aren't exactly fond of sharing secrets with anyone. Whenever an Imperial void-capable ship is being constructed, there is always a section, usually near the prow, that is set aside for the exclusive use of the Navigator. This section can range from 2 to 10 deck levels in diameter, depending on the size of the vessel in question and the exact nature of certain, usually ancient, oath-sworn pacts, made between either individual merchant captains or the commanders of the Imperial Navy fleets to which the ship belongs, and the Navigator family that is supplying the Navigator. This part of the ship, usually known as the Navigator's sanctum, is all but hermetically sealed from the rest of the vessel which it is built into. This is in part to prevent anything that could possibly disturb the Navigator at his or her essential work, and in part to isolate the Navigator from the rest of the crew as much as possible. Navigators are, after all, mutants, which the religious law of the Imperium makes them heretical simply by existing. And while most humans recognize the necessity and importance of the role they play, they usually try to have as little to do with Navigators as they can manage. The Navigators, equally aware of their own indispensability and of the status and power that indispensability has granted them, are more than happy to reciprocate and have as little to do with the affairs of common humanity as they can manage. But make no mistake, with great power comes great responsibility, and ensuring the safe passage of starships by staring into the madness of the warp is not an easy burden to bear, even for someone who is quite literally born and bred for the role. The warp is chaos incarnate. It is an ephemeral plane of cackling demons and shrieking souls in torment. In fact, one of the many nicknames for the warp is the Sea of Souls. But like any sea, the warp has currents, it has eddies and tides, and, as strange as it may sound, these currents can be detected and predicted. There is, for lack of any better term, method to the madness, and it is the duty of the Navigator to pierce through that madness and guide the ship along these thin, stable warp routes. Failure to do so will condemn the vessel and all on board her to being stranded within the immaterium and subjected to all of its innumerable horrors. Warp travel usually works like this. The vessel in question powers up its warp drive, which then punches an ugly hole between realities, allowing for the ship to enter the warp. Meanwhile, the Navigator, safely ensconced in his sanctum, closes his normal human eyes and opens the third one in the middle of his forehead. If a Navigator were to stare into the warp with his natural eyes, he would be just as susceptible to madness as any other human. The third eye is important because it functions as a kind of visual filter. It enables the Navigator to stare for long hours into the immaterium, guiding the ship along a warp route, while also allowing them to retain their sanity. How a Navigator perceives the warp varies from person to person. One might perceive of it as a dark forest, and the warp route as a beaten path that the vessel must not stray from if it is to survive. Still another might perceive the warp as a burning waste, another as a shining multicolored ocean, still another as a yawning void. These are all different ways in which the Navigator's third eye filters the immaterium into something that the Navigator's mind can interpret and understand. But no matter how the Navigator may perceive it, there is always one single constant, a great beacon of light representing the Astronomicon, the light of the God Emperor of mankind, acting as essentially a lighthouse in the warp without which navigators would not be able to steer their ships by, thus rendering all faster-than-light warp travel utterly impossible. Only through their mutant gifts are the navigators able to perceive the Astronomicon and use it to safely guide their vessels through the madness. However, literally staring into the abyss is both a physically and mentally draining exercise for the navigator, and the length of a warp jump is usually determined by the individual navigator's ability and stamina. When the navigator feels his strength to be depleted, he signals the bridge, who then in turn disengages the warp drive, allowing the vessel to break back into material space. When not performing his vital function, the Navigator not only closes his third eye, but usually keeps it covered as well, under some kind of headdress. For the third eye is not just a filter for the madness of the warp, it can also be a weapon. Navigators are not psychers, but they can, with enough experience and training, channel the power of the warp briefly through their third eye to lethal effect. To look upon a Navigator's third eye is to die in agony and madness beyond the scope of human imaginings. And it is for this reason, in addition to religious prejudice and elitist snobbery, that Navigators and baseline humans mix as little as possible. The origins of the Navigators are one among many things that have been lost to the history of the Imperium. They are only speculated to have existed prior to the Age of Strife. Indeed, they don't show up in the Imperial historical records until after the Unification Wars and the Emperor had begun launching his Great Crusade. This has led some people to suggest that the Emperor himself created the Navigators in addition to the Space Marines and many other institutions of the Imperium. Regardless of the truth, it is certain that the Emperor fostered the Navigator families and that they were to play a cornerstone role in his reconquest of the galaxy. Arguably the oldest example of which being the Treaty of Olympus between Terra and Mars. If you recall my History of the Adeptus Mechanicus video, then you know that as part of the Treaty of Olympus, the Emperor gave to the Martian Mechanicum at least 5 Navigator families, thus enabling the Tech Priests of Mars to rediscover their lost Forge worlds and recreate their own empire. So yeah, Navigators were a big deal during the Great Crusade, and possibly even before that. That said, both the Navigators and the Astronomicon were ultimately stopgap measures. For the Emperor, as mentioned previously in other videos, was attempting to tap into the Eldar Webway network. Doing so would enable humanity to travel at faster-than-light speeds, but without the inherent dangers of actually traveling through the warp itself. This would, however, have rendered the Navigators utterly obsolete, thus dumping them back in the same box of hatred and persecution that all the other mutants and abhumans of the Imperium have to put up with. Unsurprisingly, many Navigator families were involved in a plot to actually sabotage the Emperor's Webway project, thus ensuring their relevance and all of the power and prestige and wealth that came with it. As it turned out, however, the Webway project was ultimately defeated not by any plot of the Navigators, but by the fact that one of the Emperor's own Primarchs allowed himself to be led around by the nose by a certain feathery chaos god of change. But that's a story for a whole nother video in and of itself. Suffice it to say, with the Webway project effectively kiboshed, Big E had little choice but to rely entirely on the Astronomicon to ensure interstellar navigation and transportation. And because he was the only person powerful enough to project the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon without dying, it meant that he was unable to participate directly in any way throughout the entirety of the Horus Heresy up until that final confrontation with the eponymous War Master at the Siege of Terra. And so, with the Emperor effectively half-corpsified and the Adeptus Mechanicus spending the next 10,000 years more concerned with rediscovering past technologies than inventing new ones, it's unlikely that the situation regarding the Navigators is going to change anytime soon. But all this time I've made reference to Navigator families. Well, there's a reason for that. You see, unlike in Dune, where the Navigators of the Spacing Guild are produced by simply grabbing random people and making them huff enough spice that they either die or start seeing visions of the future, the Navigators of 40K are the product of thousands of years of carefully calculated genetic manipulation. For you see, the Navigator's third eye, and all of the abilities that it entails, is a product of the so-called Navigator gene, a genetic trait that just happens to be recessive. This means, if you remember high school biology, if the little r in a Punnett square represents the Navigator gene, then the only way that the Navigator gene finds expression in an offspring is if said offspring's genotype is r. This is the most important job of a Navigator family, to ensure that the Navigator gene breeds true as often as possible and to produce as many Navigator children as possible. This means Navigators only breed, let alone marry, among their own kind, and such unions are often made as much for political and economic gain for the two houses in question as it is to ensure the continuation of the respective bloodlines. Such arrangements are almost always made by the head of each respective Navigator family, known as the Novator. In addition to ensuring the continuation of their family lines, the Novators are also responsible for managing the finances of their house and ensuring that its jealously guarded secrets stay that way. For, as any student of history knows, when you mix the immense wealth achieved through a monopoly of something, in this case interstellar trade, with dynastic politics, cutthroat intrigue is sure to follow. And the Navigator houses are always looking for ways to either get one over on their rivals or to prevent their rivals from getting one over on them. None of this is common knowledge, of course, for just as an individual Navigator is isolated from the rest of the crew of the ship that he or she pilots, the Navigator families are in turn deliberately isolated from the rest of the Imperium, ensconcing themselves in the incredibly opulent Navigator's Quarter just outside the precincts of the Imperial Palace. Even the agents of the Inquisition have a hard time investigating the affairs of the Navigator families, and thanks to that oft-repeated monopoly on space travel, the Inquisition only ever dares involve themselves in Navigator affairs when they have utterly airtight, damning evidence. Even then, outside intervention is rarely necessary, as the Navigator families, or Navis Nobilitae, are very good at policing themselves, and are always quick to extirpate the truly traitorous elements from among their number. Navigator houses are roughly divided into 4 broad categories, usually defined either by prestige within the Navis Nobilitae or the lack thereof. First are the magisterial houses. These are the true blue bloods among blue bloods, dynasties that can trace their lineage all the way back to the Unification Wars. These are the Navigator families that are almost exclusively found within the Navigator's Quarter on Terra, the ones that have private armies at their command and possess amounts of wealth so obscene that it puts most planetary governors and even some of the High Lords of Terra themselves to shame. These are the families with monopolies on trade routes and the most prestigious contracts, either with the Imperial Navy, the arc fleets of the Adeptus Mechanicus, or even the spaceships of Adeptus Astartes chapters. Next, in descending order of prestige and wealth, are the nomadic houses. These are families that have cut ties with Terra and the Navigator's Quarter, and so spend their entire lives in space, preserving their bloodlines by working with single, albeit massive fleets of starships. Though not nearly as wealthy or famous as the magisterial houses, thanks to their lives of constant traveling through space, nomadic houses are known to produce arguably the best and most talented navigators in the Imperium. Next are the so-called shrouded houses. These are the families that have suffered some great dishonor or loss of prestige and privilege. Essentially, families that have fallen from grace, and who spend much of their time struggling to regain their old glories. Like the nomadic houses, the shrouded houses of the Navigators don't live on Terra, but where the nomadic houses do so willingly, the shrouded houses are usually banished from Terra by the Navis Nobilitae, and usually base themselves on the fringes of Imperial space. And finally, there are the renegade houses. These too are often houses that have been exiled from Terra, but where a shrouded house is usually exiled as a result of some great misfortune, loss of power, or some great blight upon their bloodline, a renegade house is exiled for some great crime against the Navis Nobilitae. Renegade houses are often most known for trying to regain their power and prestige by adopting radical genetic manipulation practices that go far beyond the normally controlled breeding programs of the other Navigator families. These practices often result in really nasty mutations, which of course inevitably lead to them being even more rejected by the rest of the Navis Nobilitae and often hunted to extinction by the Inquisition. At the very top of the Navis Nobilitae is the Patanova, the most powerful navigator of them all. Yet, despite being the one in charge, technically, the Patanova doesn't really seem to have any political role, at least none that I've been able to determine in my research. In fact, the Patanova barely interacts with any of the Navigator families at all, including his own. In fact, he spends practically his entire life sealed away in a massive, well-staffed palace and interacts with the outside world only through intermediaries. His, or her, primary job is essentially to act as a booster for the rest of the Navigators and amplify their abilities. Once again, this is something that is never properly explained, and really casts a shadow of vagueness as to the exact nature of the Navigator's abilities and just how connected or not connected to the warp they are. All that we really know for sure is that whenever the Patanova is nearing the end of his or her run, this usually lasts no more than 1,000 years, as even rejuvenat treatments can only keep you alive for so long, a small group of the most powerful Novators from among the Navigator families are designated the heirs apparent and are brought to the Patanova's palace. Eventually, the Patanova dies, and in the ensuing, and hopefully brief, interregnum, Navigators across the Imperium see their abilities decrease markedly. Meanwhile, at the instant of the Patanova's death, the designated heirs apparent begin to mutate and turn on each other. Now, all Navigators begin to show significant mutations in their latter years, which suggests that the Navigator gene is connected to some kind of genetic instability within the Navigator's makeup. But in this instance, not only are the mutations more significant, but as the heirs apparent begin to kill one another off, they each become far more aggressive. In the end, only one of the heirs apparent is left standing, he or she becomes the new Patanova, and Navigators throughout the galaxy see their abilities restored to their normal levels. The new Patanova then goes into isolation for the rest of his or her long, long life, only to be eventually replaced by another one when their time comes. Due to this life of necessary and enforced isolation, the Patanova has nothing to do with the politics of the Imperium. Instead, the interests of the Navis Nobilite are represented by one from among their number who is given the title of Patanoval Envoy. So then, let us recap. In the 41st millennium, life for everyone in general sucks. If, however, you are lucky enough, debatably, to be a Navigator, you will have been born into a life of immense, indeed unimaginable luxury and privilege. However, in exchange for all of these material comforts, you will be rigorously trained for a lifetime of essentially guiding vessels through a literal hellscape and of constantly taxing your mind to the limit as you stare into said hellscape in order to find the safest routes. Assuming you ever manage to leave that life behind, after probably serving at least for a few decades, if not centuries, you will enter onto a world of utterly cutthroat politicking and intrigue. And if, by some mad miracle, you manage to make it to the very top of this proverbial rat race, you are essentially condemned to life in isolation from the rest of the world as a living signal booster for the rest of your fellows. And all of this will be in service to a state and a culture that essentially hates your guts and condemns you simply for existing. Life as a Navigator is undeniably a gilded cage, with more than a few awkward bloodstains. But when the only known alternative is essentially a shitty iron cage with spiked bars, hey, at least your cage has some silk padding. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.